The crimson sun painted the Pacific horizon as Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood on the bridge of the battleship Yamato, his weathered hands gripping the rail with an intensity that betrayed his inner turmoil. It was June 2nd, 1942, and the combined fleet was steaming toward what many believed would be Japan's greatest naval triumph. Yet something gnawed at the architect of Pearl Harbor, a persistent whisper of doubt that his subordinates had dismissed too readily. 6 months had passed since the surprise attack that brought America into the war, and Japan's military machine had swept across the Pacific like a typhoon. Wake Island, Hong Kong, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, all had fallen before the rising sun. The Imperial Navy's carrier pilots, the elite of the elite, had proven themselves invincible in every engagement. Their confidence bordered on arrogance, and that arrogance had begun to infect the very core of Japanese naval planning. Commander Minoru Genda, the brilliant tactical mind behind the Pearl Harbor attack, moved through the carrier Akagi's ready room where pilots prepared for what they believed would be another routine victory. The young aviators laughed and boasted, their voices carrying the swagger of men who had never tasted defeat. They spoke of the Americans as if they were children playing at war, forgetting that wounded beasts often fight with desperate fury. In the intelligence section aboard the flagship, Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe hunched over decoded intercepts, his brow furrowed with concern. American radio traffic had increased dramatically in recent days, and the pattern suggested something far more organized than the scattered resistance they had encountered thus far. He had submitted 3 separate reports to his superiors, each highlighting anomalies in enemy communications that suggested the Americans might possess advanced knowledge of Japanese intentions. According to declassified naval intelligence documents from the National Security Agency, Japanese cryptographers had detected unusual American naval communications patterns weeks before the Midway operation, but these warnings were largely dismissed by senior commanders, confident in their operational security. The dismissal came swiftly and with barely concealed contempt. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commander of the 1st Air Fleet, had built his reputation on decisive action, not cautious analysis. When Tanabe's concerns reached him, Nagumo's response was characteristic of the prevailing attitude within the Japanese command structure. The Americans flee before us like rabbits. Why should Midway be different? This hubris extended beyond individual commanders to the very foundation of Japanese strategic thinking. The concept of Yamato Damashi, the Japanese spirit, had become not just a source of strength, but a dangerous blind spot. The belief that spiritual superiority could overcome material disadvantages had served Japan well in its rapid expansion, but it also fostered a dismissive attitude toward intelligence that contradicted preconceived notions. Captain Ryunosuke Kusaka, Nagumo's chief of staff, had privately expressed reservations about the complexity of the Midway operation. The plan required precise timing across multiple task forces separated by hundreds of miles of ocean, with success dependent on the Americans reacting exactly as predicted. Yet even Kusaka found himself swept along by the momentum of victory and the infectious confidence of his peers. As the great fleet sailed eastward through the night, carrying 4 of Japan's 6 fleet carriers and the cream of its naval aviation, the seeds of disaster were already taking root. Intelligence warnings lay buried beneath layers of institutional arrogance, while across the Pacific, American codebreakers worked feverishly to turn Japan's greatest strength, its predictability, into its most fatal weakness. The stage was set for one of history's most decisive naval battles, where overconfidence would collide with preparation, and where the ignored signs would transform into instruments of unprecedented violence. In the basement of the Navy Department building in Washington, Commander Joseph Rockford adjusted his bathrobe and poured another cup of coffee, his bloodshot eyes scanning the latest intercepts from Station HYPO in Pearl Harbor. It was May 26, 1942, and for weeks the soft-spoken cryptanalyst had been piecing together fragments of Japanese naval communications like a master detective solving the crime of the century. The breakthrough had come through a stroke of brilliant deception. Suspecting that the mysterious designation AF in Japanese messages referred to Midway, Rockford had convinced the Midway garrison to send an uncoded message reporting problems with their water distillation plant. Within days, Japanese intelligence dutifully reported that AF was experiencing water shortages, confirming what Rockford had suspected all along. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, stood before a wall-mounted chart in his Pearl Harbor headquarters, studying the intelligence summary that would either validate the greatest gamble in American naval history or lead to catastrophic defeat. The Japanese plan, as decoded by Rocheford's team, was audacious in its scope: a diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands, followed by a massive assault on Midway, designed to draw out and destroy the remnants of the American Pacific Fleet. Intelligence reports later declassified by the Naval Security Group revealed that American codebreakers had achieved approximately 60% penetration of the Japanese Navy's JN-25 cipher system by May 1942, providing unprecedented insight into enemy operational planning. The irony was profound. While Japanese intelligence officers like Tanabe were filing reports that their own high command ignored, American intelligence was being embraced at the highest levels of command. Nimitz had staked everything on Rocheford's analysis, positioning his 3 available carriers in a carefully planned ambush north of Midway, where they could strike the Japanese fleet while remaining undetected. Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher aboard the carrier Yorktown understood the magnitude of the risk they were taking. His task force, hastily repaired after the Battle of the Coral Sea, represented nearly half of America's remaining carrier strength in the Pacific. One miscalculation, one failure of intelligence, and the Pacific War could be lost in a single afternoon. Yet Fletcher also recognized the opportunity. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, American forces would have the advantage of surprise. Meanwhile, aboard the Japanese flagship Yamato, Admiral Yamamoto's staff continued their final preparations with methodical precision. The complexity of Operation Me, as the Midway assault was coded, required coordination between multiple task forces spread across thousands of square miles of ocean. The Aleutian Diversionary Force under Admiral Kakuji Kakuta had already departed, while the main body under Yamamoto himself would provide distant support. For Nagumo's carrier striking force, the Japanese plan assumed that American forces would react predictably, rushing to defend Midway only after the attack had begun, allowing Nagumo's carriers to destroy the island's defenses before turning to face the inevitable American counterattack from a position of overwhelming advantage. This assumption, born from months of easy victories, would prove to be their greatest miscalculation. Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton, Nimitz's intelligence officer, had spent sleepless nights cross-referencing every decoded message, every fragment of intercepted communication. The picture that emerged was both terrifying and promising. The Japanese were committing their most powerful forces to a single decisive battle, but they were doing so with complete confidence that their enemy remained blind to their intentions. In the carrier-ready rooms of Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, American aviators prepared for battle with grim determination rather than swagger. They understood they were outnumbered and facing the most experienced carrier pilots in the world. But they also carried with them something their opponents lacked: the knowledge that their enemy believed himself invincible. As both fleets converged on the small coral atoll that would give its name to one of history's most decisive battles, the contrast in intelligence preparation could not have been starker. The Americans, guided by superior intelligence and hard-won humility, positioned themselves for the ambush of a lifetime, while the Japanese, blinded by their own success, sailed unknowingly into the most devastating trap in naval warfare history. The pre-dawn darkness of June 4, 1942, hung over the Pacific like a shroud as Nagumo's carriers turned into the wind to launch their first strike against Midway. Aboard the carrier Akagi, Lieutenant Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki led 108 aircraft into the gray morning sky, their engines creating a thunderous symphony that announced Japan's arrival at what they believed would be another inevitable victory. Nagumo stood on Akagi's bridge, watching his seasoned aviators disappear into the distance with the satisfaction of a commander who had never known defeat. His four carriers Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu represented the most potent concentration of naval air power ever assembled. The previous evening, his meteorologists had predicted perfect flying weather, and intelligence reports suggested only minimal American resistance at Midway itself. Yet even as the first wave departed, troubling signs began to accumulate like storm clouds on a clear horizon. Radar operators on the Japanese ships detected unusual activity to the northeast, but these reports were quickly dismissed as atmospheric interference or possibly migrating birds. The concept that American carriers might be lying in wait seemed impossible to commanders who had grown accustomed to catching their enemies completely by surprise. On Midway itself, Marine aviators scrambled their obsolete aircraft in a desperate attempt to intercept the incoming Japanese strike. Major Lofton Henderson led his squadron of Douglas Dauntless dive bombers in what every man knew was likely a suicide mission against the Japanese carriers, the Marine pilots, flying aircraft that were already outdated when the war began, understood. They were buying time with their lives for forces they could only hope were coming to their aid. According to combat action reports archived at the National Museum of the Pacific War, Marine Aviation Group 22 at Midway launched every available aircraft in the early morning hours of June 4th. Despite knowing they faced overwhelming odds against veteran Japanese pilots flying superior aircraft, the first Japanese attack wave reached Midway at 6:30 in the morning, unleashing a carefully coordinated assault that demolished fuel storage facilities, destroyed aircraft on the ground, and reduced much of the island's infrastructure to smoking rubble. Yet even as his pilots reported initial success, Lieutenant Commander Joichi Tomonaga, leading the strike, radioed a message that would prove fatal to Japanese hopes: second attack necessary to neutralize remaining defenses. This single transmission would trigger a cascade of tactical decisions that transformed Japanese strength into vulnerability. Nagumo, confident in his pilot's assessment, ordered his reserve aircraft to be rearmed with bombs for a second strike against Midway, abandoning the armor-piercing weapons and torpedoes that would be needed for anti-ship operations. Unknown to the Japanese, American patrol aircraft had already spotted their fleet. Lieutenant William Chase, flying a consolidated Catalina flying boat on an extended search pattern, transmitted the electrifying message that would change the course of the Pacific War. Enemy carriers bearing 320 degrees, distance 180 miles, course 150, speed 25 knots, aboard the carrier Enterprise. Admiral Raymond Spruance received Chase's report with the calm demeanor that would mark him as one of America's greatest naval commanders. Unlike his Japanese counterparts, who had grown accustomed to fighting enemies who reacted to their initiatives, Spruance understood that he held the ultimate advantage: the element of surprise. Combined with precise knowledge of enemy positions and intentions, the American carriers began launching their strike groups, even as Nagumo's aircraft were still attacking Midway. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey led Enterprise's air group into the morning sky, followed by similar formations from Hornet and Yorktown. These pilots carried with them not just the hopes of their nation, but the accumulated intelligence work of months of patient code-breaking and analysis. As the two forces converged in the vast emptiness of the Pacific, the fundamental difference in their tactical situations became apparent. The Japanese, supremely confident but increasingly reactive, found themselves responding to developments they had never anticipated. The Americans, flying with the certainty that comes from superior intelligence, moved with purpose toward targets they knew with mathematical precision. The stage was set for the most decisive few hours in naval aviation history, where months of ignored warnings would collide with meticulous preparation, and where the violence that followed would reshape the balance of power in the Pacific forever. At 7 minutes past 10 on the morning of June 4th, 1942, the aircraft carrier Akagi's flight deck presented a scene of organized chaos that would soon transform into catastrophic disaster. Nagumo's flagship buzzed with activity as deck crews worked feverishly to rearm aircraft for the anticipated second strike against Midway, while others prepared planes for anti-ship operations. Following reports of American naval forces in the area, the admiral himself paced the bridge with growing agitation, caught between conflicting reports and the weight of decisions that would determine the fate of the Japanese Empire. Scout aircraft had indeed located American ships to the northeast, but their initial reports contained a critical omission: no mention of carriers. This intelligence gap, born from inadequate reconnaissance procedures that Japanese overconfidence had allowed to persist, would prove more costly than any defeat in battle. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga's damaged aircraft limped back toward the fleet, trailing smoke and carrying wounded crew members, living testimony to the fierce resistance encountered over Midway. His radio reports painted a picture of successful destruction, but also emphasized the need for a second attack to completely neutralize the island's defenses. This assessment, accurate though it was, pushed Nagumo toward a fateful decision that would leave his carriers vulnerable at the worst possible moment. In the maintenance spaces below Akagi's flight deck, ordnance crews worked with desperate efficiency to switch armament configurations. Bombs designed for land targets were being removed from aircraft and replaced with armor-piercing weapons suitable for attacking ships, a process that required careful handling of volatile explosives under combat conditions. The deck spaces filled with stacked ordnance, fueled aircraft, and ammunition, a floating arsenal waiting for a spark. Historical records from the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force archives indicate that the armament change aboard Nagumo's carriers on the morning of June 4th required approximately 90 minutes to complete, during which time hundreds of bombs, torpedoes, and fuel lines were exposed on the hangar decks. Unknown to the Japanese fleet, American dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown were already approaching from the northeast, guided by radio beacons and the precise intelligence that had positioned them for this moment. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's air group, had made a crucial navigation decision that would place his squadrons directly over the Japanese carriers at the moment of maximum vulnerability. The irony was devastating in its completeness. While Japanese intelligence officers had correctly identified increased American radio activity and unusual fleet movements, their warnings had been dismissed by commanders who believed American forces incapable of coordinated offensive action. Now those same American forces approached with mathematical precision, guided by intelligence that surpassed anything the Japanese had achieved. At 10:22, lookouts aboard Akagi spotted the distinctive silhouettes of American dive bombers beginning their attack. Runs from 14,000 feet. The moment crystallized everything that had gone wrong with Japanese intelligence and tactical thinking. Their carriers were caught with aircraft being refueled and rearmed, their combat air patrol out of position, and their defensive formations optimized for the wrong threat entirely. Lieutenant Dick Best, leading Enterprise's bombing Squadron 6, selected Akagi as his primary target with the cold calculation of a professional warrior. His Douglas Dauntless screamed earthward in a 70-degree dive, the carrier's flight deck growing larger in his bomb sight with each passing second. Behind him, his squadron mates followed in precise formation, their training and preparation about to converge with months of superior intelligence. In a moment of unprecedented violence, the first bomb struck Akagi's flight deck at 10:26, penetrating to the hangar spaces below where aviation fuel and armed aircraft created an inferno that would consume the pride of the Japanese fleet. Within minutes, similar scenes played out aboard Kaga and Soryu as American dive bombers, attacking with surgical precision, transformed the most powerful carrier force in the world into funeral pyres visible from 50 miles away. Nagumo stood, transfixed on his burning bridge as the consequences of ignored intelligence and overweening confidence manifested in their most terrible form. The signs had been there: the unusual American radio traffic, the coordinated movements detected by Japanese reconnaissance, the very fact that enemy forces were positioned to attack at precisely the moment of maximum Japanese vulnerability. All had been dismissed in favor of assumptions based on past victories rather than present realities. As Akagi's ammunition began cooking off in secondary explosions that shook the massive carrier like a child's toy, the admiral, who had never known defeat, faced the unthinkable reality that Japan's naval supremacy was burning around him. In the space of 5 catastrophic minutes, the carrier Hiryu, steaming 20 miles northeast of her burning sister ships, became the sole surviving platform for Japanese naval aviation, as black smoke columns marked the graves of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, commanding Carrier Division 2, stood on Hiryu's bridge surveying a scene that would have been unimaginable just hours earlier. The most powerful naval striking force in history had been reduced to a single carrier, and her escorts in less than 10 minutes of American dive bombing. Yamaguchi, known throughout the Imperial Navy for his aggressive tactical thinking and American Naval Academy education, understood better than most the significance of what had just occurred. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he had studied American industrial capacity and recognized that Japan's window for decisive victory was rapidly closing. Now, with 3/4 of his carrier strength eliminated, that window had slammed shut with devastating finality. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, his aircraft patched and refueled after the morning strike on Midway, approached his squadron commander with grim determination. Despite fuel system damage that made his return to Hiryu unlikely, the veteran pilot volunteered to lead the retaliatory strike against the American carriers that had appeared like avenging spirits from the northeastern horizon. His decision embodied the spirit that had carried Japan to early victories, but also the fatalistic acceptance that those victories had been built on foundations more fragile than anyone had imagined. The 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters that Tomonaga led toward the American task force represented the final offensive capability of Nagumo's once mighty fleet. These pilots, veterans of Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, and the Dutch East Indies, flew with the knowledge that they were likely writing the final chapter of Japanese naval aviation dominance. Their aircraft, already worn from months of constant operations, strained to carry the bombs and torpedoes that represented Japan's last hope for salvaging victory. From the jaws of catastrophe. Combat reports preserved in the Naval Historical Center archives document that Hiryu launched 2 separate strike waves against American carriers on June 4th, totaling 54 aircraft from her complement of 64 operational planes. At 11:58, Tomonaga's force located the American task force and pressed home their attack with the professional skill that had made Japanese naval aviation feared. Throughout the early months of the Pacific War, the carrier Yorktown, already damaged from the Battle of the Coral Sea and hastily repaired at Pearl Harbor, took 3 bomb hits that started fires and knocked out her power systems. For a brief moment, it appeared that Japanese striking power might yet extract some measure of revenge from the morning's disaster. Admiral Fletcher, commanding the task force from Yorktown's bridge, ordered the transfer of his flag to the cruiser Astoria as damage control parties fought to save his flagship. The irony was not lost on him. The same intelligence that had positioned American forces for their devastating morning attack had failed to provide adequate warning of the Japanese counterstrike. Superior intelligence could provide opportunities, but battles were still won by the courage and skill of individual warriors facing mortal danger. A second wave from Hiryu, led by Lieutenant Commander Seiichi Hashimoto, found Yorktown again in the early afternoon, scoring torpedo hits that left the carrier dead in the water and listing heavily. The sight of the American flagship apparently sinking provided momentary satisfaction to Japanese pilots who had witnessed the destruction of their own carriers just hours earlier. Yet even this success proved illusory. Yorktown would survive the day, though she would fall victim to a Japanese submarine 3 days later. The final act of the carrier battle began at 5:10 in the afternoon, when American dive bombers from Enterprise and Hornet located the surviving Japanese carrier. Lieutenant Commander Earl Gallagher led 24 Dauntless aircraft in the attack that would complete the destruction of Nagumo's force, diving on Hiryu with the same precision that had eliminated her sister ships that morning. Rear Admiral Yamaguchi, watching American bombs tear through his flagship's flight deck and ignite fires that would consume the ship, made a decision that epitomized both the honor and the tragic waste of the Pacific War. Rather than transfer to a surviving escort vessel, he chose to remain aboard Hiryu and share the fate of his command. His final radio message to Admiral Yamamoto was characteristic in its brevity. "All for carriers lost. Will ram enemy if opportunity permits." As the sun set on June 4th, 1942, the most decisive day in Pacific naval history drew to a close with Japan's carrier striking force effectively eliminated. For fleet carriers, 300 aircraft, and most irreplaceably, the veteran pilots who had been the backbone of Japanese naval aviation lay at the bottom of the Pacific, or dying in hospital ships. The signs that intelligence officers had identified and senior commanders had ignored had materialized into a catastrophe that would reshape the course of the Pacific War and ultimately determine its outcome. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto received the devastating reports from the Midway battle aboard his flagship Yamato with the stoic composure that characterized Japan's greatest naval strategist. But those who knew him best could see the profound shock in his eyes. By midnight on June 4th, 1942, the full magnitude of the disaster had become clear. For fleet carriers destroyed, over 300 aircraft lost, and most catastrophically, the cream of Japanese naval aviation eliminated. In a single day's fighting, the architect of Pearl Harbor understood better than anyone the strategic implications of what had occurred. Japan's entire Pacific strategy had been predicated on achieving decisive victories before American industrial might could be brought to bear. Now, with his carrier striking force eliminated, the initiative had passed irrevocably to the Americans, and the war of attrition that Yamamoto had desperately sought to avoid had become inevitable. In the radio rooms of surviving Japanese ships, communications officers worked frantically to implement damage control of a different sort, controlling the narrative of defeat to minimize its impact on national morale and military confidence. Initial reports spoke of mutual losses and successful diversionary operations in the Aleutians, carefully omitting the complete destruction of Japan's most powerful naval striking force. This manipulation of information, born from the same institutional arrogance that had led to ignoring intelligence warnings, would prove equally damaging in the long term. Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe, the intelligence officer whose warnings had been dismissed, found himself in the bitter position of having been proven catastrophically correct. His detailed reports about unusual American radio traffic and coordinated naval movements had been archived and ignored, while the fleet had sailed blindly into the most devastating ambush in naval history. The culture that had produced such willful blindness to unwelcome intelligence would prove difficult to change, even in the face of overwhelming evidence of its failures. According to post-war interviews conducted by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, Japanese naval intelligence capabilities were significantly compromised by institutional biases that favored information confirming existing operational plans while discounting intelligence that suggested enemy capabilities beyond preconceived expectations. Meanwhile, American intelligence officers were conducting their own assessments of the victory, but with a focus on understanding what had made their success possible, rather than obscuring uncomfortable truths. Commander Joseph Rochefort's code-breaking team at Pearl Harbor had provided the foundation for the victory through months of patient cryptographic work, but equally important had been the willingness of American commanders to base operational decisions on intelligence analysis rather than wishful thinking. The human cost of Japanese intelligence failures extended far beyond the strategic level, to the individual pilots and sailors who had paid with their lives for their commanders. Overconfidence. Veteran aviators like Lieutenant Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki, who had led the morning strike against Midway, found themselves floating in life rafts amid the wreckage of their burning carriers, contemplating how completely their world had changed in the space of a few hours. The irony was particularly acute for pilots who had survived the Pearl Harbor attack. They had begun that December morning with surprise and intelligence as their allies, striking an unprepared enemy with devastating effect. Now they experienced the reverse situation, caught completely off guard by an enemy who knew their every move and had positioned forces accordingly. The lesson was clear, though many Japanese commanders would prove unwilling to learn it. In modern warfare, intelligence superiority could be more decisive than numerical advantage. or individual courage. Admiral Chester Nimitz, reviewing the battle, reports at his Pearl Harbor headquarters, understood that Midway represented more than a tactical victory. It marked the fundamental shift in Pacific War dynamics that would ultimately determine the conflict's outcome. The Japanese fleet that had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months no longer existed as a cohesive striking force, and American industrial capacity was beginning to produce the ships and aircraft that would carry the war to Japan's home islands. The broader implications extended beyond purely military considerations. Japan's early victories had been built on the assumption that American resolve would crack under the weight of initial defeats, leading to a negotiated peace that would recognize Japanese hegemony in the Western Pacific. Instead, the Midway disaster would galvanize American determination while simultaneously eliminating Japan's capacity for further strategic offensive operations. As rescue operations continued through the night of June 4th and into the following day, the full cost of ignoring intelligence warnings became apparent in the most personal terms. Hundreds of Japan's most experienced naval aviators, men who represented years of training and combat experience that could never be replaced, had been lost in a battle that superior intelligence preparation might have avoided entirely. The Japanese hospital ship Hikawa Maru limped away from the Midway battle zone on June 6, 1942, carrying the burned and broken survivors of what had been the Imperial Navy's most elite fighting force just 3 days earlier. Among the wounded was Lieutenant Commander Matsuo Fukuda, the pilot who had led the Pearl Harbor attack and now lay bandaged and contemplating how completely the fortunes of war had reversed in the space of 6 months. Fukuda's personal reckoning mirrored that of his nation. The same overconfidence that had produced stunning early victories had blinded Japanese leadership to the growing capabilities and determination of their enemies. His fellow pilots, those fortunate enough to survive the inferno of their burning carriers, spoke in hushed tones about the precision and coordination of the American attack. These were not the desperate, uncoordinated responses they had grown accustomed to facing, but the actions of an enemy that had learned, adapted, and prepared with methodical determination. Emperor Hirohito received the initial reports of the Midway disaster in his palace study, surrounded by the ritual formality that insulated Japan's highest leadership from unwelcome realities. The carefully crafted language spoke of tactical setbacks and strategic redeployment, but the underlying truth was unmistakable. Japan's offensive capability in the Pacific had been effectively eliminated in a single day's fighting. The war that was supposed to have been won in 6 months would now drag on for years, with outcomes that no one dared contemplate. The institutional failures that had produced the Midway disaster proved remarkably resistant to correction. In the weeks following the battle, Japanese naval headquarters issued new intelligence directives emphasizing the need for more thorough analysis of enemy capabilities and intentions. Yet the same officers who had dismissed warnings about American radio traffic and fleet movements remained in positions of authority, their fundamental assumptions about American fighting capabilities largely unchanged. Declassified documents from the Japanese Defense Agency reveal that post-Midway intelligence reforms were largely superficial, with senior commanders continuing to base operational planning on optimistic assessments of enemy capabilities rather than accepting the more sobering realities suggested by careful intelligence analysis. Commander Joseph Rockford, meanwhile, found himself in the unusual position of an intelligence officer whose work had directly enabled one of history's most decisive military victories. Yet even as congratulations poured in from Washington and Pearl Harbor, Rockford understood that the code-breaking success at Midway represented just the beginning of a longer struggle. The Japanese would undoubtedly change their codes and procedures, making future intelligence coups more difficult to achieve. The strategic implications of the Midway victory rippled outward through American military planning, with transformative effect. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, authorized accelerated production schedules for new aircraft carriers and began planning offensive operations that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. The psychological impact proved equally important. American commanders, who had spent 6 months reacting to Japanese initiatives, could now begin imposing their will. On the Pacific battlefield for Japan, the path forward led inexorably toward the desperate defensive battles that would characterize the remainder of the Pacific War. Without the carrier striking force that had enabled their early conquests, Japanese strategy devolved into a series of increasingly costly attempts to hold defensive positions with insufficient resources and declining pilot quality. The institutional arrogance that had dismissed intelligence warnings at Midway would manifest repeatedly in the coming years, as Japanese commanders continued to base planning on wishful thinking rather than harsh realities. The human cost of these strategic failures extended far beyond the immediate casualties of the Midway battle. Young Japanese pilots, hastily trained to replace the veterans lost in the burning carriers, would face increasingly hopeless odds as American industrial might produced aircraft and pilots in numbers that Japan could never match. The culture of victory that had sustained Japanese morale through the early months of expansion would gradually erode under the weight of cumulative defeats and mounting casualties. Admiral Yamamoto, reviewing the final casualty reports from Midway in his flagship cabin, understood that he had witnessed the beginning of the end of Japanese naval supremacy in the Pacific. The signs had been there in the intelligence reports that were dismissed, the enemy capabilities that were underestimated, and the overconfidence that substituted wishful thinking for careful analysis. Now those ignored warnings had materialized into a catastrophe that would ultimately cost Japan not just the Pacific War, but its dreams of empire itself. The Battle of Midway stands as perhaps history's most compelling example of how intelligence superiority, properly utilized, can overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. The violence that erupted on June 4, 1942, was not random or inevitable, but the direct result of one side's willingness to heed unwelcome truths, while the other remained willfully blind to gathering storm clouds. In the end, Japan's military elite had ignored the signs, and Midway had capitalized with violence that changed the course of human history.